Well, welcome to the Rochester Birding Association September members meeting. I hope you all had a good summer. We're getting back into the swing of things with tonight's speaker. And before we have that, I've got a few announcements for the membership. And I'm looking at my phone. I'm not trying to be rude, but this is where I have all my notes. Okay, so pardon me while I'm not looking at you. We have a number of upcoming events, some field trips, including the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. I think that's coming up this weekend. Yeah, the Saturday. That's always a good one. Braddock Bay East Spit. That's on Sunday, yes. And there's been a nice collection of shorebirds out there in the mudflats. And who among us couldn't use a little practice in identifying shorebirds, right? So that would be a good one. There's going to be a couple of trips on a couple of different weekends to Ganondagan State Historic Site. We've got one to Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge. The Hamlin Beach State Park coming up. This one sounded interesting. The Silver Lake State Park Big Sit, which is apparently similar to a birdathon, but all the observations must be made within a 17-foot diameter circle. And so it's basically sitting there for a period of time, monitoring the birds and the what's around. And I believe who's the name of the person that's Matt Nusstein? Yes, that's right. Nusstein is the one that will be there all 8 hours, I guess. But if you want to go and just kind of hang out for a while, help him, he'd sure he'd be happy for the company. Okay. And so for more information on all those, please go to the website, rochesterbirding.org, and look up the various field trips. Yes, it's also in the little goal for those folks who get that hard copy. Let's see, we have our September Birds and Brews. It's coming up next Tuesday, the 16th, from 6 to 9 at Three Heads Brewery on Atlantic Ave. We've been having a pretty decent crowd coming out, so which is really nice. So if you want to come and sit down and talk to some fellow birders, have a tasty beverage, it's a great chance to do that. So please join us. Again, that's next Tuesday from 6 to 9 at Three Heads Brewery. Lastly, we are looking for some more volunteers to help with Smash the Crash. This is a joint effort with the U of R, RIT, and the Rochester Birding Association to monitor bird crashes on our downtown Rochester buildings during migration seasons. There are 2 routes of 6 buildings apiece that we're trying to monitor every day of the week until the end of October. A volunteer will take a day to walk one of those routes. Usually takes about an hour, and then monitor any or report on any birds that they find. And of course, at this point, they're dead, so that's a sad thing. But and then report on them via a phone app, which is really easy to use. I'm actually doing Tuesdays and Thursdays, Route 1 for all the Route 1 folks. Yay, let's go. But at any rate, we could always use more volunteers. We're planning on doing this again in the spring, I believe. And this is really to determine if there's an issue, one, and if there is, to help use the information to help persuade the building owners to perhaps make their windows more bird safe. So it's a great example of something local that the RBA can have a positive influence on. So I think this is it's a really great opportunity. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, please contact Charlie Plimpton. He's actually sitting here, but his contact information is in the last page of the little goal. Okay. So with that, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Candy, who will introduce our speaker.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Richard Fuller, joining online all the way from Brisbane, Australia. And over there right now, it's about 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So he's joining us during his morning. Richard is not only a lifelong and very keen birder, he admits he's incurable on that front, but also a scientist whose work has had a major impact on the conservation of migratory shorebirds. Many of you will know that the birds we enjoy along our coasts and wetlands often undertake astonishing journeys, linking the US, Russian Arctic with Asia and Australia. Richard's research has been central to uncovering why some of these species, like the eastern curlew and bar-tailed godwit, have declined so steeply in recent decades. His work has shown how loss of habitat in critical stopover sites such as the Yellow Sea is driving those declines, and importantly, how international conservation action can make a difference. Beyond the science, Richard is deeply engaged in turning research into real-world outcomes. His findings have influenced government policies, led to threatened species listings, and helped shape conservation strategies across more than 20 countries. Tonight's talk will blend science and birding, taking us from the Arctic tundra to the searing heat of the Australian mudflats, exploring both the threats and the hopeful signs of recovery for these extraordinary travelers. And I just also want to add that I found his website, fullerlabs.org, and there's some fascinating articles there if you want to check him out on his website.
Richard, we're ready for you.
Hi, folks. I seem unable to share at the moment. Share screen. Oh, here we go. It's working. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, hello, folks, and thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak to the Bird Club, and it was just really great listening to the announcements just then. Clearly, a very active Bird Club, and thank you for all the activity and work you do. I saw your youth programs, and it's great to see that birds and collisions in buildings program going on. Yeah, thank you for all your work, and thanks for inviting me here today. As Candy says, I'm speaking to you from tomorrow, and I can report that it's a lovely sunny day so far and things are good in the future. So my name's Professor Richard Fuller. I'm speaking to you from the University of Queensland here in Brisbane on the east coast of Australia. And I want to begin by acknowledging the Yagara and Turrbal people who are the traditional custodians of Meanjin, the lands from which I'm talking to you today. The Yagara and Turrbal people have cared for and listened to the lands and waters of this area for tens of thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I acknowledge that their sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. Something about me, perhaps in common with many young boys, here I am pictured in the 1970s with my dad when flared trousers were very popular. Like many young kids, I wanted to be a train driver when I grew up. Trains really fascinated me. I thought that sounded great fun. My dad was an engineer, and I think this fitted in very clearly and neatly with his vision for me. But then as my childhood moved on, I became kind of weirdly obsessed with bird life and began watching birds kind of all around. Bought my first pair of very cheap, very poor quality binoculars but that magically brought the birds closer to me. And, becoming a bird watcher as a teenager is kind of a challenging time in your life to undertake that sort of transition. But nevertheless, there I was, an awkward teenager with a fascination that seemed to come from nowhere in bird life and nature around me. And this really took hold, I think, through my teenage years. And I became so passionate and obsessed almost with just studying nature, being in nature, and just spending time with it. And here I am volunteering at a local nature reserve. I grew up in London, and this is on the edge of the city. And actually, there's a fair amount of green space and bird life present in London. So this was really my childhood, a kind of fascination with being in nature. But somehow also knew that I always wanted to study it. And when I worked out that you could actually go to university and really study these things, I think my path was set. And really my introduction to shorebirds emerged during that university year. So I went to the University of Durham in Northern England to do my PhD. And my PhD was on ruddy turnstones. It was, at the time, I studied behavioural ecology. So how do the birds decide where to feed and where to roost and so on. And I spent a lot of time in the field watching ruddy turnstones. And they're, of course, beautiful birds. But even today, I still have a slight twitch of anxiety and stress when I see a turnstone, all those months spent watching them in the field. But I love them very dearly. They're very characterful shorebirds. This kind of almost magical transition from their breeding plumage that you can see here. This is a bird that was in Australia in June, which it shouldn't really have been there. So it's probably a migrant that kind of had to terminate its migration journey and come back to Australia and showing us, in its beautiful breeding plumage. And the ruddy turnstone, of course, is a very long distance migrant. If you look at a map on eBird of the ruddy turnstone, it's everywhere in the world. It's an incredibly widespread species and its migrations are immense. And I'll show you some tracks of those in a minute. Now, I heard also in the announcements you're planning a shorebird watching trip coming up, and I can understand if that strikes terror into the heart of many a bird watcher. Shorebirds are fiendishly difficult to identify in many cases. Someone might look at this and one birder might say, oh, that's great. Look at all those ID challenges. This is wonderful to pick through and work them all out. Someone else just might run for the hills, right, on seeing the diversity of shorebirds and also the kind of challenge that is involved with identifying them and counting them. And perhaps because there is such a challenge and kind of tied in with these stories of migration, there has been, I think, a special place for shorebirds in the heart of many birders around the world. They're kind of beautifully diverse. You can see lots of different bill shapes, lots of different bill lengths, different kinds of foraging strategies. And they're always in amazing kind of places where, where water meets land. And they're beautiful places and beautiful birds. But let's begin with the story of the migration of one of the shorebirds that connects Australia with the US. This is the bar-tailed godwit. And the data you're looking at here come from 2007. This was the first time that satellite tracking devices were fitted to bar-tailed godwits. And this was done in New Zealand. And a female bird called E7 was fitted with a satellite transmitter. And the researchers were excitedly awaiting for her departure. On the 17th of March 2007, she left the mudflat in New Zealand that she'd been present on for all of the austral summer and took a single flight all the way to eastern China. That's a flight of 10,300 kilometers without stopping. Bar-tailed godwits, although they're kind of water birds, they can't land on the sea. So this is powered flight the whole way from New Zealand all the way to eastern China, where she pitched down on a giant mudflat on the border between China and North Korea called Yalujiang and spent a few weeks there voraciously feeding up and getting ready for the next leg of her marathon migration. On the 2nd of May, she took off again from this mudflat in China and flew, another cool 6,500 kilometers right across the northern Pacific to Alaska. The satellite track indicated that the bird then went on to the Arctic tundra and bred. So the bar-tailed godwit was breeding. Then following that breeding event, we don't know what happened in that breeding event. You can't tell that from the tracker. But on the 30th of August, she took off again. She'd been refueling on the giant mudflats just outside Anchorage, and she was ready to go on the 30th of August. And at this point, the researchers didn't know how these godwits got back to New Zealand. They imagined they may go back through the way they came, that it was really too far for these birds to cross the Pacific Ocean in its entirety. But the bird just joyfully proved them all wrong and undertook a 12,000 kilometer direct flight for 8 days and 8 nights, continuously flying from Alaska all the way back to New Zealand, where she landed back on the same mudflat that she had taken off from all those months ago in the North Island of New Zealand. And every time I tell this story, it just blows my mind how these birds do it, how they navigate, how they find their way, and how they so seemingly casually do these immense migration journeys with such accuracy that they're amazingly built for it. And of course, what the bird is doing is, in New Zealand, the bird is spending the summer, right? And it's spending its whole life in summer. If you think about it, it breeds in the northern summer, flies down to the southern hemisphere for the southern hemisphere summer, where there's lots of activity in the mudflats and the bird can feed and gain weight, as you can see in that bird on the right, on the bottom picture there. So this bird transitions from being a mudflat bird in the non-breeding season to a tundra bird in the breeding season, and as you know, changes its dress accordingly. Amazing stories. And now, for subsequent work from that initial tracking data showed these very strong, very clear connections in the bar-tailed godwit subspecies Boweri, which nests in Alaska and migrates down to Eastern Australia and New Zealand. But it does this kind of clockwise migration. When it's going north, they fly through that Chinese and Korean peninsula area and up on to Alaska, and then back across the Pacific Ocean in a giant clockwise migration. The bar-tailed godwits that breed just across the Bering Strait in far eastern Russia, they do a more simple migration that also goes through that same Yellow Sea area, but down to Western Australia. So immense migrations, and you'll notice that the birds are stopping in that Yellow Sea region. And remember that place, we'll come back to that. That's the area between eastern China and the Korean peninsula. There are also ruddy turnstones that migrate between Alaska and the southern hemisphere. Some of there are 2 subspecies of ruddy turnstone. One of them is mostly in the old world, breeding through Europe and northern Asia. But a few of those breed in Alaska, or quite a few of those breed in Alaska too, and they migrate down or downwards towards the southern hemisphere from there. And this map is very busy. Don't ignore much of the text. I just want you to focus on the lines. These are migration tracks from one individual bird. So looking at that red line first, this bird was fitted with a geolocator, which is a way of tracking where the bird is, near the city of Melbourne in southeastern Australia, so right down the bottom there. And looking at the red line, on its migration north, it tracked up through the Yellow Sea region once again. And this particular bird then pushed all the way north and bred in eastern Siberia. But following breeding, it again amazed the researchers what happened next. Instead of tracking back down through Eastern Asia, the bird continued across the Bering Strait into the Aleutian Islands, where it spent a number of weeks refueling in the Aleutian Islands before undertaking a huge trans-Pacific migration. The ruddy turnstone can't fly 12,000 kilometers without stopping, but it is very well equipped to stop on Pacific Islands. Any of you that have been to Pacific Islands will know that turnstones are kind of almost everywhere. And some of those birds that are there have come from thousands of kilometers away and are stopping on Pacific Islands on the way back to the non-breeding area. And then the yellow track shows what the bird did the very next year. Similar overall pattern, but a large number of individual differences in where that bird stopped. So although it knows roughly where it's going, it's happy to be quite adaptable and stop in different places each year. That's quite different to the bar-tailed godwit, which will often be seen in exactly the same spots along the migration route from year to year. So incredible migrations, another great big round trip. The Pacific golden plover, another shorebird species that breeds in Alaska as well as Asia and migrates down to the southern hemisphere. I won't go through this one in detail, but it just shows, just drink in that kind of complexity and the beauty of the migration routes that these birds are doing. They're breeding, of course, right in the far north, and many of them are undergoing these sort of clockwise migrations northwards through Asia, southwards across the Pacific Islands. Those that are nesting in the more westerly parts of Russia are doing kind of to and fro migrations. So immense beauty and complexity in the migration routes of that species. Just a few more species to think about, and then I'll move on to the sort of conservation issues that these birds are facing. The lovely dunlin. This is a bird, the Arcticola subspecies, which breeds in Alaska. There's around 400,000 of them. More or less entirely migrate into the Eastern Hemisphere. Most of them spend the non-breeding season in Japan, with a few on the southern Chinese coast. So there's really very strong connections between, in particular, Alaska and various parts of Asia and the southern hemisphere. Of course, just a few thousand years ago, there was a land bridge across the Bering Strait. And as far as the birds are concerned, Alaska and the far east of Russia are geographically very similar. So here where many of the Alaskan breeding dunlins are spending the non-breeding season, mostly through Japan and southern China, as I mentioned. And US Fish and Wildlife have been doing lots of work on this. Rick Langto has been leading a program studying dunlins for a very long time in Alaska. Sharp-tailed sandpiper, a little bit rarer as an Alaskan breeder, extremely common in Australia. Lots of them, of course, breed across into Russia as well. And sharp-tailed sandpiper is one of our commonest shorebird species down here on the east coast of Australia. It's always a delight to welcome them back in big numbers, and they're, of course, beginning to arrive right now. So sharpies are good. We try to look among the sharpies to try and pick out pectoral sandpipers, which are much rarer down here. But it is a regular migration of pectoral sandpipers from Alaska to Asia and Australia. So we regularly get pectoral sandpipers turning up in Eastern Australia, not just as a vagrant, but as an uncommon non-breeding visitor. Of course, on top of all these birds, we get heaps of other vagrant shorebirds that come from North America, but the ones I've talked about are really connecting the US with Asia and Australia. We also have the wandering tattler, of course, here burying its head in the sand, and another trans-Pacific migrant that loves to hang out in the coral reefs and atolls of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, as well as Pacific Islands all around that great ocean. So lots of connections between us and you in terms of migratory shorebirds. And of course, as the shorebirds undertake these huge migrations, they pass through many different geographic and political contexts, and they face many different pressures as they move through different locations. And if you think about it, if you're migrating, and you're stopping in various places along the way, you need all of those stopping places to be suitable habitat, to be in good condition, right? If one of those links in the chain is impacted by some environmental problem, that could spell disaster. That could mean that your precisely timed migration, you've got just the right amount of fuel to last you, and then you arrive at a place and the habitat has been destroyed by something. That can spell the end for individual shorebirds. And we know that many of them die directly when there are land use changes. And I'll give you an example of that later on. So just some quick stories from where we are here. This is Brisbane. So, sorry, down on the left-hand side, you can see a map of Australia. I'm in Brisbane on the east coast of Australia at the moment. And in Brisbane, we have a huge bay called Moreton Bay. So we have some offshore barrier islands, which are mostly made of sand. And inside Moreton Bay, there's lots of mud and mangroves. It's perfect shorebird habitat. And there's between 30, well, there used to be 50 to 60,000 shorebirds visiting Moreton Bay each year. It's a very major non-breeding site, including many birds that come from Alaska. Now there are, I'm afraid, between 25 and 30,000. There's been a huge decline. How do we know this? Well, because of volunteer counters. Local bird clubs, the Queensland Wader Study Group, have been counting shorebirds in Moreton Bay for decades. And this has provided an incredible data set that we've been able to analyse to understand what's happened to the birds. The bird club came to the university in 2008 and said, we're worried about the birds and we'd like you to take a look at the data and see if you boffins at the university can crunch the numbers and tell us if we're right to be afraid. And I still remember the day that I first opened the spreadsheet, the data, and just looked at it on a graph. I was utterly horrified. Here's just one of those graphs I looked at all the way back in 2008. The red knot, which is grey, of course, when it visits us here in Australia, had declined enormously over the few decades leading up to that period. And you don't need to be a hotshot statistician to see that something is going on with this species in Moreton Bay on the east coast of Australia. We did engage a hotshot statistician by the name of Howard Wilson, who crunched all the numbers and painted the picture in horribly quantitative terms. These percentage numbers you see here are the rate of declines of different shorebird species here in Moreton Bay. So you'll recognise Bartail godwit and ruddy turnstone. Yeah, they're coming to us from Alaska, declining by multiple percentage points every single year. And if you think about it, you can't sustain that level of decline in a population. If you're losing 9% of your population every year, it won't be many decades before you're extinct. So we were incredibly concerned back in 2008, 17 years ago, when we saw these data. We were horrified and panicked, to be perfectly honest. Rob Clements decided to try to look at the picture across the whole of Australia and also the New Zealand data as well. Can we start to understand for our whole flyway, all of these millions of birds that are migrating up and down this East Asian Flyway, are they all in trouble or is it just a few? And again, you know, it's depressing often dealing with these kinds of data. You're uncovering horrible things that we wish weren't happening. And sorry about the graph, but what you can see, the thing to take away from this graph is if you're below that dotted line, you're in significant national decline across Australia and New Zealand, which means really that the whole flyway population of that species is in massive trouble if you're entirely below that line. So everything from the left-hand side right up to common greenshank is in huge decline. This means this really panicked us. This suggested to us that the entire flyway populations of many species were in free fall, were in big trouble, and we needed desperately to try and understand what was going on. Now, this work kicked off many different labs around Australia and around Asia and across the world to try to look into this problem and work out what was happening. I'll just tell you about one project that got underway very quickly after this. And that project was focused on a species called the Far Eastern curlew. So look at the bill of that bird in Amanda's hand. It's massive. It rivals the long-billed curlew. And in fact, the Far Eastern curlew is actually bigger than the long-billed curlew, which gives you an impression of how huge it is. And it's in fact the largest migratory shorebird in the world. Why were we so concerned about this bird? Well, the population monitoring data were terrifying. The species had declined by 80% in 30 years. 80% of the Far Eastern curlews in the world had disappeared over a 30-year period. And once we'd done this analysis, it was enough to get this species listed as critically endangered in Australia and endangered globally. We're very worried for the future of this bird. There's probably about 25,000 of them left in the world. As you may know, 2 curlew species have gone extinct already, the northern curlew from North America and the slender-billed curlew from Eurasia. Curlews seem to be, in a vulnerable group, and the Far Eastern curlew, we're very worried, is heading in the same direction. So what Amanda's doing here is fitting satellite trackers to some Far Eastern curlews to try and understand what threats these birds are facing along their migration journeys. One of the first places we looked was in our own backyard. Here you can see urban Brisbane in the middle of this map. And there are 2 birds on this map, green and yellow. And we began to find out exactly which spots around the bay these birds are using. They're commuting up to 50 kilometres each day between feeding and roosting sites. And this information has been really, really useful for local marine park managers in Moreton Bay to actually identify and protect the important places that these birds are feeding in. But if you look at this map, you'll see on the mainland coast on the left-hand side, it's heavily urbanised. And most of the important roosting sites for shorebirds, where they go to sleep when the tide comes in, have been developed and are disappearing. And there's immense concern that we need to really get a handle on coastal development here in Australia to try to reduce this issue. These satellite trackers also show us the international migrations of the Far Eastern curlew. We managed to tag birds from 4 different locations around Australia that you can see on the map on the right-hand side. Those birds then began their migrations north, and you can see again a huge concentration of these birds along the Chinese coast and in that Yellow Sea region, that kind of giant bay between eastern China and the Korean peninsula. So once again, for this species, as for many, many other shorebirds, that Yellow Sea region is critically important as a refueling site along the way. Once the curlews are refueled in that Yellow Sea region, they push on into far northeastern China and far eastern Russia to breed. And that they don't go all the way to the Arctic. They're much more of a subarctic sort of steppe breeder, and then they turn around and go back south again. So given that all of these shorebirds are undertaking such massive migrations, I mean, to them, 20,000 kilometres in a year is just kind of regular business. Where do we look across these giant migration paths to try and understand why these birds are declining so fast and to try to design conservation actions? And I'm going to take us through the parts of the migration journey of these shorebirds and just pull out a few examples of the threats they're facing. And here are data from one of those satellite tagged Far Eastern curlews. These data have just been put together literally in the last few days. So this is the first time I've really had a good chance to look at these data. You can see here there are 6 years of tracking data from this particular bird. This is the same bird coming back to its nesting site for 6 years. and we can see precisely where that bird is nesting. We have been in touch with the manager of this nature reserve in China, and they didn't know there were far eastern curlews nesting in there. And actually, it's almost impenetrable. It's quite a difficult reserve to gain access to. So they haven't been able to go in yet to try to monitor these birds. So I want you to take away two things from this. First of all, the bird's going back to the same spot each year. And that's an incredible kind of site fidelity, if you like. It's going back to the same area of habitat. But the second, more chilling issue here is you can see the kind of circular smudge that the birds are in, right? This whole region here is a nature reserve. This kind of circle is a nature reserve. And outside of that circle, you can see lots of square patterns in the landscape. Those are rice paddies, and those are completely unsuitable habitat for the curlews to be nesting in. In fact, this nature reserve is entirely surrounded by rice paddies, of which a lot of rice is grown in northeastern China. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a few dots. Sometimes the breeding birds fly out and forage in those rice paddies, but they do not and cannot breed in those areas. What you're seeing here is the last refuge of what was formerly once very widespread swampy marshland habitat that these birds nested in, and now much of that has been given over to rice paddy production. So many of the nesting sites for the Far Eastern curlew, the highly endangered Far Eastern curlew, have been turned into farmland. Let's head a bit further north and think about those species that breed in the Arctic. Here is a Pacific golden plover on the Arctic tundra. A huge issue in the Arctic, among many others, is climate change. Climate change is happening faster in the Arctic than any other region in the world, and it has a very damaging effect. It causes the permafrost layer, which is near the surface of the tundra, to thaw and to drop, so that the surface of the tundra becomes drier more quickly during the summer season and has much less food and is much less suitable for nesting shorebirds. It also causes shrubs and trees to sort of migrate north, and other predators like red foxes to sort of push north into the Arctic. Walkup did a project here at the University of Queensland trying to understand what the impacts of climate change might be on migratory shorebirds that nest in the Arctic. And I'll just show you some very quick summary data from her project. This is a map of sort of climatic suitability for shorebirds at present. So you can see the North Pole in the middle, the kind of Russian coastline on the right-hand side, Alaska up the top, Arctic Canada and Greenland there on the left-hand side. And this is showing where the climate is suitable for migratory shorebirds to breed right now. And what Hannah then did was to project that model forwards to 2070. And what she found was that the vast majority of the Arctic will be climatically very different to how it is now. And that may mean that those shorebirds that are nesting in the Arctic will struggle to reproduce successfully. We don't know that for sure because we've never tried massive climate change as an experiment before, but we're going to find out what happens within the next few decades. Arctic Canada and some of the islands off Arctic Russia remain climatically stable for shorebirds multiple decades into the future. And it may be that many shorebirds have to crowd into those areas to get through. There is good news coming at the end of this talk, by the way, so it's not all doom and gloom. So let's imagine our birds have kind of survived and run the gauntlet of breeding, and they're off on their southward migration. There's just been a landmark study published in Nature and Ecology and Evolution just 3 days ago, in fact, where a whole bunch of Chinese researchers went out identifying and counting and measuring nets that were being placed in various wetland habitats along the Chinese coast. They found unfortunately enormous evidence of illegal hunting of shorebirds going on, as you can see on the left-hand side, of netting that was designed to catch fish and other marine organisms, incidentally catching shorebirds, particularly as the tide goes out and giant flocks of birds are wheeling around, and also deterrence nets that are set up on aquaculture ponds to deter, and also on mudflats where shellfish farming is done to try to deter birds, ends up actually killing very large numbers of them. And Liang and colleagues showed that somewhere between 50 and 100,000 shorebirds die every year in that part of China alone because of netting that's been put out along those wetlands. And if you kind of sum up all of these different threats, I mean, there really is a lot that these birds are facing. But what of the main habitat that these birds love? The tidal mudflats. Here's a picture of a huge expanse of tidal mudflat in the Republic of Korea. This is on the east coast of the Yellow Sea. This is what the birds are after on their migrations. We might see a featureless mudflat. The birds see a fast food restaurant completely stacked with food, which will enable them to continue their migrations. We've been looking at satellite data to understand what's happening to tidal mudflats in the Yellow Sea and elsewhere. Here's a map, a satellite photo from 1975 taken at low tide. It's a developed coastline. This is in China, but you can see there's a thick grey fringe along the coastline. That's a massive mudflat, all right, several kilometres wide at low tide. If I show you the same picture just 30 years later, that mudflat has largely disappeared and been replaced by enormous coastal development projects, ports, aquaculture, ponds, urbanisation, factory infrastructure and so on. Huge coastal development projects. Here's a particularly infamous project from Korea on the east coast of the Yellow Sea. Look over there on the left in 2001. You'll see there's a sea wall being built across the mouth of this bay. This bay is 400 square kilometres in size and supported around 500,000 shorebirds on migration. And you can see the wall that's gradually being built on the left-hand map there. That wall is 33 kilometres long, right? And it's going to encapsulate the entire estuary. Looking at the middle picture, in 2006, there was an enormous battle in the Supreme Court of Korea to try to get this project stopped. Obviously, there were many thousands of people in Korea who were utterly horrified about the consequences of this project and tried to stop it. The Supreme Court ruled in favour of finishing the seawall and killing the estuary in 2006. That was done. The seawall was closed. The estuary became a lake overnight, became atidal, and the mudflats died. And you can see them, the mudflats kind of bleaching and just drying and dying. And on the right-hand side, a more recent aerial photo, that entire estuary is now being filled in and given over to agricultural expansion and so on. Massive, massive projects that will be almost unthinkable are happening. And this is what much of the coastline looks like around the Yellow Sea. This photo was taken just north of Shanghai. And ecologists have dubbed this China's second Great Wall, the thousands of kilometre long seawall that stretches along the coastline and has reclaimed, I hate that word really, it's a very euphemistic word, taken away stolen land that used to be mudflats and turned it into dry land. Nick Murray investigated how big this issue was using satellite data. We can find these big projects, but how widespread are they and how much of the habitat has lost? And I'm afraid to say the data were horrifying. Nick managed to show that around 2/3 of the mudflats in the Yellow Sea had disappeared in the last 50 years. The map there on the right-hand side, whenever it's red, it shows that mudflat has disappeared. Let me just say it again, 2/3 of the mudflat that these birds depend on when they migrate to and from the Arctic has disappeared in the last 50 years. it's no wonder we're seeing crashes in the populations of these migratory shorebirds. This is an international issue, not just because the birds are migrating to many countries around the flyway, but because 3 countries share stewardship of the Yellow Sea tidal mudflats. This is the most complex graph of the talk, and I'm getting towards the end. So if you don't want to interpret the graph, just listen to the words that I'm saying. What we wanted to show was whether we could show scientifically that this loss of mudflats in the Yellow Sea was actually the cause of the shorebirds' decline. And this graph is the heart of showing that the answer to that is yes. What it shows is that species that depend most on the Yellow Sea, each dot on this graph is a species, those species that depend a lot on the Yellow Sea, on their migrations, are declining the fastest, right? So our Far Eastern curlew, remember them? They depend on the Yellow Sea almost entirely. They're declining incredibly fast. The grey-tailed tattler on the top left-hand side, that species does not migrate through the Yellow Sea, and it's doing just fine. It's not declining. In fact, it's even increasing a little bit. So the birds that are in the biggest trouble are the ones that migrate through the Yellow Sea, and we believe that's the reason why, the primary reason why these birds are declining so fast. It's not the only reason. All the other things I've mentioned matter, but habitat loss in the Yellow Sea was the #1 smoking gun, and something had to be done about it urgently. Fortunately, all of this doom and gloom information that was coming out, it's scary, but it's also empowering. And many people have risen to the challenge of trying to do something about this. This is Jing Li, who founded the spoon-billed sandpiper in China NGO, which is kind of a risky business to do. Jing Li is very outspoken about the ecology and conservation of shorebirds in China. And there is a whole community of Chinese scientists and campaigners who are increasingly arguing that we need to protect these coastal habitats and their birds for both human well-being and for ecological stability in East Asia. So many people are working hard. Governments are also talking more and more with each other. Since 1970, there's been a huge growth in the number of intergovernmental agreements in our flyway. The US is a major partner in all of these discussions that are happening. NGOs have recently begun joining in a very big way, talking to each other, sharing experiences, trying to reverse the declines of these birds. There's a great success story, the Latham snipe. This species migrates between Australia and Japan. That's the only 2 countries that it really visits. It breeds in Japan and spends the non-breeding season here in Australia. It was declining fast. The species was being hunted in both countries. An agreement was signed between Japan and Australia to protect the migratory birds that fly between their 2 countries. Hunting was stopped as a result of that ban. The Latham snipe is secure and safe and doing well in Australia and in Japan. A success story. It does work. Policy analysis of all of these different agreements is showing that they're very well set up, mostly to prevent habitat loss. So lots of discussion happening between all the different countries about protecting habitat. There's less going on about hunting. And I think because we know that can be successful, we need to get more countries talking about how to stop hunting. There's been a huge effort to try to protect important sites for migratory shorebirds all the way from Alaska to Tasmania and New Zealand. And lots of progress is being made. 900 important sites for these birds have been identified. 165 of them so far have been declared as flyway network sites by this organization of 20 countries that have got together and said we want to protect these migratory shorebirds. So progress is being made. Many of those sites that are not yet flyway sites are protected by other means. So we are beginning to make great progress. Jennifer George is the chief executive of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, which is a group of 20 countries, 20 NGOs that meet to try to prevent further loss and take action. Alaska has two sites present in this flyway network site, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and Kupaluk in Alaska, both of which are incredibly important sites for migratory shorebirds and signify the US's engagement with international conservation. Within the Yellow Sea, just as we draw towards a close, there's been an intense effort to identify and protect the most important remaining sites. It is a bit of a disaster zone. Much of the important habitat has been lost already, but important sites do remain, and it's critical those are protected. And people have worked so hard to try to create action here. And in 2018, the biggest piece of good news for decades came out of this flyway, and it was an announcement by the Chinese government that these highly damaging coastal reclamation projects were going to be more or less banned, and that no further projects were going to be allowed. Simultaneously in Korea, it wasn't quite as formalized, but the major reclamation projects have now all finished in Korea, and there are unlikely to be any further major planned projects in both countries. This was an incredible win for conservation. I was jumping up and down and running up and down the corridor when this announcement was made. I was jumping up and down again the following year when the decision was made by the Korean government and the Chinese government to declare a number of World Heritage sites around that Yellow Sea region to protect some of the remaining giant mudflats of the area. These sites are not yet perfect. They don't include quite everywhere that needs protection, but it's a signal to the world. It's a very public-facing signal that major habitat loss is a thing of the past in these areas. So I'm delighted about that. I have some hope for the future, while still a sense of concern about the rapid declines. Just before I finish, let's go back to near where we started, our friend the Far Eastern curlew. What happened after those horrible early days of documenting the rapid declines of this flagship species in our flyway? Well, it turns out over the last 10 years, the population trajectory of that species has stabilized. And I can barely believe that I'm saying this. The Far Eastern curlew has not declined in the last 10 years. And we have seen similar patterns for some of the other migratory shorebirds, including the bar-tailed godwit in this flyway. I think there is evidence that the heavy conservation action that has been taken is beginning to show results in reduced population declines for these shorebirds that we love. So I'm optimistic about the future of these birds. For the last 20 years, I've worked on these birds. I've been in despair for most of those years. But over the last few years, there are signs of hope, and I'm becoming increasingly excited and increasingly hopeful about the future. Thanks very much for listening tonight, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Okay, Richard, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I have a microphone. Do we have any questions? And then please get the microphone before you ask it. Neil, hang on.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Thank
can.
you so much for a wonderful presentation. I'm curious, it's admirable that the People's Republic of China and the Republic of Korea are beginning to acknowledge this issue and preserve habitat. Out of curiosity, has there been any similar action by North Korea?
That's a good point. The short, so yes and no. So the North Korean government has actually officially joined the Flyway partnership. So that large group of countries, North Korea is part of that and shows up to discussions around migratory bird conservation. That in itself, I think, is quite a significant signal. And it's also great that the other countries involved are also still willing to be part of all those discussions. Now, New Zealand and North Korea have quite a special friendship, and a number of New Zealand researchers have been into North Korea looking at habitats in North Korea, and they're actually reporting some relatively major projects happening in terms of coastal development in North Korea. We don't really know the full extent of that. We do know that some of the mudflats in North Korea have declined quite dramatically. The thing I didn't mention in the talk is that a lot of mudflats are being lost because sediment flows from the major rivers have been reduced dramatically by dams that have been put in further up the rivers. So there are losses in tidal flats around the Yellow Sea, but also in North Korea. And, I guess protected areas and conservation are not the highest priority there. So I think it's mixed signals so far from North Korea.
Other questions? Any from our Zoom colleagues?
Yeah, I have one question from the Zoom audience here. Are there any, oh, nope, that's my own question to the Zoom audience. Never mind.
Hold on a second, Dominic.
Do you know if there are similar things going on along the Atlantic coast between United States and Europe? And are you involved with any coupling with the activities in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. Short answer is yes, there are. There's some very active, similar kinds of programs happening in other flyways around the world. There's huge efforts along the West Coast, Pacific Flyway, through the Americas, and also the Atlantic Flyway as well. And also, of course, across in the Eurasian African system. I would say those three flyways, the North American, Pacific and Atlantic flyways and the European African, they have very advanced sort of partnerships between researchers, governments and NGOs. There isn't the same sense of there being a single catastrophic failure, if you like, in those flyways that's leading to really big trouble. There are lots of issues happening in those other flyways too. The Delaware Bay story is one thing, right? And there are lots of issues happening. I think the difference around this flyway, the East Asian Flyway, has been that catastrophic loss of the giant staging area. But yes, there are many other initiatives around the world. I would say the US is set up particularly well. There are joint ventures that connect local activities with kind of flyway scale activities. There's lots of international networks. There are Western Hemisphere shorebird meetings and collaborations that pull together countries from the non-breeding range as well as the breeding range. So yes, there's a lot happening. And yeah, searching for those initiatives online will no doubt turn up things that people can join and get involved with.
Any other questions? Oh, hang on.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hello, yes.
Why was China reclaiming those mudflats? Did it have to do with climate change or something else?
Yeah, good question. Reclaiming the mudflats. So that's been done in China for actually thousands of years. Through pre-industrially, mudflats were being reclaimed. Primarily, if you think about it, reclaiming a mudflat gives you lovely, lovely flat land on the coast, and that's highly attractive. So in a modern context, the Eastern China is intensely developed. There's intense urbanization and high intensity agriculture across much of Eastern China. There's a lot of competition for land, and reclaiming tidal flats is a way of generating nicely developable flat land on the coast. So creating land that can be used for agriculture and industrial development. That's really the primary reason why so much reclamation has been done. So it was initially for agriculture, now more so for urban and other forms of development. Ironically, there's also lots of renewable projects happening in those areas, so wind farms and solar farms happening in those reclaimed areas, but it's mostly to generate developable land that can be cheaply developed on. Yeah.
I have a question about with global warming and sea levels rising, will a lot of those mud flats disappear under those circumstances?
Yeah, another good question. And sorry, the previous question was also hinting at that and I didn't answer. Yes, that's right. So we've estimated around 40% of all the mud flats in the flyway would disappear if under a 3-meter sea level rise scenario, which is quite a high one. It'll be decades before it gets that high. So yes, I'd say they're vulnerable to sea level rise. Sea walls themselves are also vulnerable to sea level rise. The tide laps halfway up most of these sea walls. And the more you build them out, of course, the more you're pushing into the deeper water and exacerbating that problem. So sea level rise will certainly be affecting the mudflats themselves. Under natural conditions, sea level rise is not very problematic for mudflats because they can sort of migrate backwards onto the land, right? Natural sort of progression, mudflats can follow sea level rise up and down. Of course, the problem when you have a highly developed coastline is that can't happen. Shanghai, for example, has an average height above sea level of 3 meters. That's a pretty big city that's acutely exposed to sea level rise. And of course, Shanghai is not going to be left to flood because of sea level rise. It's going to be defended. And that's going to create all kinds of issues along the Chinese coast. My hunch is that there will be realignment of many of the sea walls as sea level rise really takes hold. This is happening in parts of North America and parts of Europe where there's managed realignment. Some areas are allowed to flood and other areas are defended. And I think the same thing will happen in the Yellow Sea coast too. But ultimately, yes, there is this issue. It's called coastal squeeze, where you have sea level rise that's eating away at the mudflats. And the mudflats have kind of nowhere to go because there's urbanization or seawalls on the other side. So that habitat gets squeezed. And that is absolutely an issue that's already begun to happen and will continue to happen.
Another question?
Hello. I have one other question. So this area has been very militarized in the last 10 years or so, maybe 20. All kinds of things going on in that general area. And these seawalls, my dad was in the Navy, so I'm thinking about this. But these seawalls, did they have some sort of defensive mechanism as well for China?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know specifically about that. So a couple of things that relate to this. The reason we know about the historical extent of mudflats so well in the Yellow Sea is because during the Korean War, the army mapped mudflats very carefully because, of course, mudflats are very dangerous for vessels. So that's a kind of interesting aside that we know that so well. And we've compared those old maps with satellite data to see how much habitat has been lost. Whether seawalls have defensive, I mean, I guess you can certainly use them in a defensive capacity. I'm not sure that's part of the motivation for building them. There are some interesting reclamation, interesting is not quite the right word. There are some reclamation projects happening in some of the disputed islands in the South China Sea. So the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands. There are indeed new islands sort of being built and seawall and reclamation projects kind of happening there, very much as a geopolitical move. So I think coastline adjustment does have geopolitical echoes. It's a way of kind of increasing the land area of a country. So I think there are, I suppose, complex motivations around them, but defence, I don't know, hadn't thought or heard anything about that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Very good. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you sharing your work with us and perhaps giving us a little bit of hope at the end.
I think there's some hope, absolutely. But thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.